Hey guys, tonight we slip back into a world where the air smells faintly of wood smoke, livestock, and damp earth. Imagine this. You wake up, not in your own bed, but in a low, thatched hut where the ceiling leans down as if it's trying to give you a hug. Your mattress? A lumpy sack of straw that crunches every time you shift. The sun's first light seeps in through cracks in the wooden shutters, and you catch the sound of chickens fussing outside. Welcome to a medieval village. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this long term. But for now, let's just enjoy the ride. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love picturing who's out there drifting off to sleep with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the quiet. Not the kind of quiet you know from modern nights, filled with humming appliances and distant traffic, but a layered quiet where every sound is alive. A rooster crows somewhere beyond the cottages. Dogs bark in uneven bursts, and a baby wails faintly before being shushed. Beneath it all, you hear the faint rushing of a nearby stream. It's a different kind of silence, less empty, more textured. You push open the creaky wooden door of your hut, and the cool morning air greets you. Mud squishes under your bare feet. Because shoes are a luxury you probably can't afford yet. A cluster of cottages made from timber and wattle and daub that's a mix of mud, straw, and sticks basically. Medieval drywall huddled close together, like gossiping neighbors. Smoke drifts lazily from hole in the roof chimneys, mixing with the smell of manure. Romantic, right? As you wander, you catch the sight of neighbors already at work. One woman bends low in her small garden, tugging up cabbages with dirt-stained hands. Children scamper after a skinny pig that clearly has no interest in being caught. A man with a face weathered like old leather trudges toward the fields with a wooden plow. A pair of oxen shuffling reluctantly ahead of him. And here's your first historical reality. Check. Roughly 90% of people in medieval Europe lived in rural villages just like this one. Most weren't knights in shining armor or lords in castles, but simple peasants grinding out a living from the land. Historians still argue whether that life was nasty, brutish, and short, or just rough, communal, and surprisingly resilient. The truth, like most things, is somewhere in the muddy middle. You wander toward the center of the village, which isn't much more than an open patch of packed earth. A well sits there, lined with rough stones, and women are already hauling up heavy buckets of water. You notice how carefully they handle the rope and bucket. It's a precious communal resource, and if you let it slip in, well, congratulations. You've just ruined the whole village's day. A few thatched huts around the green are bigger than the rest, belonging to families who've done a little better for themselves. Maybe they've got 2 pigs instead of 1 or enough land to grow surplus barley. The social ladder here isn't about flashy wealth, it's about whether your kids get enough bread to avoid gnawing on tree bark in the winter. You pause by a small shed where smoke curls out of the roof. Stepping closer, you realize it's the village blacksmith's forge. Sparks flash as he hammers away, shaping an iron hoe. His arms are thick, his apron caked with soot, and the rhythmic clang of metal on metal cuts through the sleepy air. Tools are lifelines here, and without him, the fields wouldn't get plowed. The wagons wouldn't roll, and honestly, you wouldn't even have a horseshoe to trip over. One quirky tidbit for you. Some medieval villages had communal ovens. Baking bread wasn't just a household task. You'd bring your dough to the village oven, pay a small fee, and bake it alongside everyone else's loaves. It was part practical, part social. Think of it as the medieval version of waiting in line at Starbucks. But instead of lattes, you're eyeing whose bread looks fluffier. As the sun climbs higher, you notice more villagers stirring. A boy chases a goose across the green, his laughter carrying on the breeze. An old man settles onto a rough bench outside his hut, pulling out a simple wooden flute and playing a tune that sounds both familiar and strange. Life here is repetitive, yes, but not without moments of music, humor, and community. You take a deep breath, catching a whiff of something less pleasant. A heap of refuse lies not far from the hut's broken pottery, vegetable scraps, and a generous amount of what we'll politely call human contributions. Sanitation isn't exactly a priority here, and yes, the village pigs are rooting around in it happily. It's a reminder that the medieval world wasn't built for comfort. That fan humming in your room right now? Yeah, villagers here would probably think you've captured some kind of spirit in a magic box. As you wander further, you spot the small wooden church at the edge of the green, its single bell hanging crookedly in a little tower. Even in the smallest villages, the church loomed large in daily life, part house of worship, part community center, part record keeper. And whether you liked it or not, your life, birth, marriage, death was all neatly filed under its authority. Nearby, children cluster together, tossing a ball made of stitched rags back and forth. Their laughter rises in bursts, a sound that feels timeless. Play, after all, has always been part of being human. Historians still argue whether childhood was truly valued in the Middle Ages, or if kids were just seen as mini adults. But watching these grubby, barefoot little ones giggling in the mud, you realize, whatever the case, joy still found its way in. As the morning stretches on, you feel the rhythm of village life pulling you in. Work and play, hunger and laughter, hardship and resilience, it's all here, woven into the smoke-filled air and the muddy ground beneath your feet. The medieval village isn't glamorous, but it's alive, and you're right in the middle of it. The village has properly woken up now, and so have you, though your body is already aching from that straw-stuffed mattress. Your stomach growls time to face the thrilling world of medieval breakfasts. Don't expect pancakes and bacon, though. Here, food is more about survival than indulgence, and mornings start simple. You shuffle toward a small table inside the hut, where a wooden bowl waits for you. Inside is a lump of yesterday's bread, rough and hard enough that you're tempted to use it as a doorstop instead of food. To soften it, you pour in a little ale. Yes, ale for breakfast. Water isn't always safe to drink, so weak beer becomes the default beverage for kids and adults alike. Think of it as medieval orange juice, except it tastes vaguely like barley soup. You take a cautious sip. It's warm, flat, and not exactly refreshing. Still, it won't poison you, and that's the win of the day. Beside the bread, there's a chunk of cheese, salty and firm, cut from a wheel that probably started aging before you were born. A smear of onion or garlic might be added if you're lucky. This isn't a feast, it's fuel. Outside, villagers are already busy with morning chores. Someone calls you over to the well, and before you know it, you're hauling up a bucket of water heavy enough to make your shoulders burn. You stumble, splash your shoes, or rather, your bare feet, and laugh nervously while the women nearby raise their eyebrows. Congratulations, you've officially been initiated into peasant life. One historical fact for you: in medieval England, the average peasant diet relied heavily on bread. Not fluffy loaves, but dark, coarse bread made from rye or barley, packed with bits of grit from the millstones used to grind the flour. Chewing this daily wasn't just tough on your jaw. It slowly wore down your teeth, like sandpaper. Dentists would have had a field day here, if dentists had existed. You wipe sweat from your brow and follow another villager to the fields. The morning sun warms your face as you step onto farmland, divided into long, narrow strips. Each family works a section, plowing with oxen that move slower than molasses. It's backbreaking, monotonous work, but everyone pitches in. You grab a wooden hoe and join in, immediately blistering your hands within minutes. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Some medieval folks believed that to ward off toothaches, you should bite a frog. Yes, a frog. Apparently. The idea was that pain would jump into the poor amphibian and leave you alone. Historians still argue whether this was genuinely practiced or just a cruel medieval joke. But either way, you might actually consider trying it after that gritty bread. As the morning stretches, you return to the hut for another bite of bread. This time, someone offers you pottage, the medieval answer to soup. It's a bubbling cauldron of whatever vegetables are lying around: beans, peas, maybe cabbage with a bit of barley tossed in. It tastes earthy, filling, and repetitive. Imagine eating this almost every day of your life. If variety is the spice of life, then medieval life was desperately underseasoned. Yet, as plain as the food is, there's a strange comfort in the rhythm. The village comes alive together, people rising with the sun, working shoulder to shoulder, and sharing meals that may be humble, but are earned. You pause to watch children gnawing happily on bread crusts, dipping them in honey when they're lucky enough to have some. One little girl grins, showing a gap-toothed smile, and waves at you with sticky fingers. In that small moment, the hardship fades, and you catch a glimpse of simple joy. Back at the green, the blacksmith's hammer still rings, echoing through the air like the village's heartbeat. The baker's oven smokes as doughy lumps go in and browned loaves come out. The smell is almost heavenly, cutting through the mustiness of the huts. You realize that, for all its discomforts, life here has a grounding rhythm, everything tied to the land, the seasons, and the community. Still, your stomach won't stop grumbling, and you glance longingly at the roasting meat you spotted earlier in the manor yard. Don't get too excited, though that feast isn't for you. For peasants, meat is a rare treat, reserved for special holidays or stolen nibbles. Most mornings, you'll just keep dunking bread in ale, pretending it's enough. The bell at the church tolls faintly, calling villagers to pause and say a prayer. You bow your head along with them, though your mind wanders. It's striking how deeply woven. Religion is into even the smallest. Routines before meals. After meals, before work, after work. You can't escape it any more than you can escape mud on your shoes. The day pushes forward, but the memory of your first breakfast lingers. You may laugh about soggy bread and warm beer now, but deep down, you know you'll miss your fridge and coffee machine more than anything. At least no one's made you chew frog yet. You've survived your first. Medieval breakfast barely, and now it's time to get dressed properly. Except when you peek into the corner of the hut. You realize there's no neat closet full of outfits waiting for you. There's just one rough tunic, hanging limp on a peg, and a pair of woolen hose that look like they've already lived through 10 winters. Forget Fashion Week, this is Survival Week. You slip the tunic over your head, and the first thing you notice is the itch. The wool scratches like an army of tiny ants marching across your skin. It's not soft, not refined, and definitely not flattering. If you're lucky, it's been washed in the stream recently. If not, You may be carrying around a few extra friends in the form of lice. Congratulations, you're living the authentic medieval experience. For most peasants, clothing is simple and practical. Tunics, hose, and maybe a hood or cloak when the weather turns cold. Colors are muted browns, grays, dull greens thanks to natural dyes made from plants. No one's strutting around in neon pink. But here's a fun fact. Contrary to the stereotype of a drab Middle Ages, peasants did wear colors like reds and blues, though the shades were faded compared to the deep dyes reserved for the wealthy. You tug on a belt made of rough leather to cinch the tunic, then wrap scraps of cloth around your lower legs as makeshift socks. They call them puttees, and honestly, they feel like medieval compression socks, except they're not improving circulation, just keeping mud out. As you fumble with the knots, a villager passes by and chuckles at your awkward attempts. Don't worry, you'll get the hang of dressing like you've time traveled from the future. Nearby, a group of women are spinning wool into thread. The hum of the spindle is rhythmic, almost hypnotic. One of them dips a length of yarn into a pot of dye made from onion skins, and the thread emerges yellow. Another pot, filled with woad, turns the wool a pale blue. You watch as the colors deepen with each dip, realizing that fashion here isn't about trends, it's about patience, craft, and whatever resources are at hand. Meanwhile, you can't help but notice the stark difference in clothing between peasants and nobles. In the manor yard, you spot a young squire strutting about in a brightly dyed surcoat, his hose neatly stitched and his boots polished. His outfit screams wealth, not because it's jeweled, but because it's clean, well-fitted. And get this, not full of holes. You feel the contrast in your itchy tunic, standing there like the before picture in a makeover ad. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants resented this obvious class divide or simply accepted it as part of life. Some accounts suggest envy simmered beneath the surface, while others point to communal values where everyone understood their place. Either way, fashion drew clear lines, silk and velvet for the nobility, wool and linen for the masses. Speaking of silk, here's a quirky tidbit. In the 14th century, laws called sumptuary laws actually restricted who could wear certain fabrics or colors. For instance, only the wealthy could wear purple or gold-threaded garments. If a peasant showed up in a fancy outfit, they could be fined or at least frowned at heavily. Imagine a world where your clothes weren't just style statements, but legal statements. You catch sight of a little boy tugging at his too long tunic, clearly handed down from an older sibling. Clothes are precious here, patched and repatched until the fabric gives out completely. Nothing is wasted when garments finally wear beyond use. They're cut into rags or stuffed into mattresses. Fast fashion? More like glacial fashion. And then there are shoes, or rather, the lack of them. Many peasants go barefoot most of the year, toughening their soles on dirt paths and rocky fields. You try walking without shoes and instantly regret it when a sharp stone jabs your foot. Some villagers wear simple leather turnshoes, soft, slipper-like, and not built for puddles. Let's just say your Nikes would have been considered magical artifacts. The day warms, and you notice villagers peeling off layers. Clothes serve as insulation in the winter, but in summer, they become heavy, sweaty prisons. Washing them isn't easy, either there's no laundromat down the road. Clothes are scrubbed in streams, beaten with paddles, and hung to dry in the open air. Soap, when available, is made from lye and animal fat, which smells about as good as it sounds. Still, there's something charming about the simplicity. Every thread, every patch. Every stitch tells a story of hands that worked hard to make it. You run your fingers along the seams of your tunic and realize someone, maybe even your medieval mother, stitched this by firelight after a long day in the fields. Suddenly, the itch doesn't feel quite as irritating. As you head toward the market, you notice more of these little clothing details, headscarves tied neatly, aprons smeared with flour, hats shaped to keep the sun off weary brows. Clothes aren't fashion statements here, they're survival tools. Status markers and family heirlooms all rolled into one. You scratch at your tunic again, sigh, and remind yourself, at least it's not frog-biting medicine.by now. You're starting to blend in at least as much as someone who clearly doesn't know how to tie their puttees properly can blend in. And today's main event awaits, the market square. Every village has its heartbeat, and here, it's the open-air market where gossip, trade, and the occasional goat chase all happen at once. The path toward the square is crowded with villagers carrying baskets, sacks, or crates. You fall in step, adjusting your itchy tunic and trying not to trip over the cobblestones. As you enter the square, the scene explodes into life. Stalls line the edges, simple wooden tables or even blankets spread on the ground, each loaded with goods. The smell hits you first, spices mixing with manure, roasted meat blending with fish that's been sitting out a little too long. You wander to the nearest stall, where a woman offers bundles of onions and leeks. Her hands are calloused, her smile toothy, and she greets you with the kind of chatter that suggests she knows every person in town and half their secrets. A few feet away, a farmer proudly displays chickens tied by the feet, their flapping wings adding chaos to the air. Money, you quickly realize, isn't always the point here. Barter thrives. A hunk of cheese might be traded for a few eggs. A pair of shoes could cost a dozen cabbages. You overhear one man offering a jug of honey in exchange for wool thread, haggling like a pro. Coins exist. Of course, especially silver pennies, but they're not always in your pouch. And judging by your current empty hands, you're more observer than buyer. You make your way to a spice stall, and suddenly, the air shifts. Here, scents of cinnamon, cloves, and pepper overwhelm the usual barnyard smell. Spices are exotic, expensive, and coveted tiny pinches worth their weight in silver. The merchant proudly announces that these treasures have traveled across deserts and sees to reach your little square. Whether he's exaggerating or not, who knows? But the thought alone feels magical. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. Pepper was so valuable in medieval Europe that it was sometimes used as currency. Peppercorn rent wasn't just a phrase, it literally meant paying rent with pepper. Imagine sliding a jar of McCormick's across the table instead of your monthly rent check. You move along to another stall where a fishmonger slaps down a large, glistening carp. The smell? Let's just say it's not the fresh ocean breeze you're imagining. Without refrigeration, fish has to be heavily salted or eaten quickly. Still, villagers line up, eager for a taste of something other than bread and cabbage. One man even waves a salted herring at you like an invitation to dinner. You politely decline, though your stomach grumbles anyway. And then there's the gossip. Markets are where news travels faster than a messenger on horseback. You overhear whispers of a distant war, rumors of a plague in the next county, and scandal about the miller who supposedly waters down his flour. Historians still argue whether medieval markets were more about economics or social bonding. But standing here, you realize they're both. You can't separate trade from chatter. A quirky tidbit drifts your way. A juggler sets up near the church steps, tossing wooden balls in the air while children shriek with laughter. Performers like him sometimes travel from town to town, earning coins or bread by entertaining villagers. He even has a trained dog that dances on its hind legs, looking far too pleased with itself. In a world without TikTok, this is the height of live entertainment. As you wander further, you notice cloth merchants unfurling bolts of linen and wool dyed in reds, yellows, and blues. You run your hands across the fabric, surprised at its rough texture. Nearby, a tanner offers leather goods belts, pouches, shoes, though the overwhelming stench of his trade makes you take 2 steps back. The smell of tanning hides lingers like an invisible fog, and the villagers give his stall a wide berth. In the corner, a brewer pours frothy ale into wooden cups, his laughter booming as he fills mugs faster than people can drink them. Alehouses often sit right by market squares, blurring the line between shopping trip and neighborhood party. You're tempted to grab a cup, but then you remember. Breakfast flat beer soaked. Bread and decide your stomach. Might need a break. Children dart between stalls, chasing after one another with sticks and pretending they're knights. A pig breaks loose from its rope and causes chaos, squealing as it weaves between legs and stalls. Laughter erupts, coins jingle, chickens squawk, and the square becomes a swirl of noise and color. And in the middle of it all, you feel oddly at home, for all its smells and squabbles. The market square is the closest thing this village has to a beating heart. Here, survival meets community, and business meets play. As you head toward the edge of the crowd, someone presses a hump of bread into your hand, a simple kindness, or maybe just a bribe for you to join their side of the barter. Either way, you accept, chewing thoughtfully. The bread is still gritty. Your jaw still aches, but this time, it tastes a little better seasoned with laughter, gossip, and the hum of life swirling around you. By the time you leave the market, you've seen more chickens than you thought possible in one lifetime. The noise of the square fades behind you, replaced by the slower rhythm of clopping hooves and the creak of a heavy wooden cart. You follow the road that winds uphill, where a large stone manor house looms. It isn't quite the fairy tale castle you were expecting. It's more practical than glamorous, but around here, this is power incarnate. The manor is the center of feudal life, while peasants like you till the soil. This is where the local lord lives, collects dues, and generally makes sure you remember your place. You step into the yard, and it's immediately clear that this is a different world from the muddy huts below. A gaggle of servants bustle about. One carries a basket of eggs, another hauls firewood, and a third shoos away an especially bold goose from the kitchen door. A couple of guards stand at the entrance, spears in hand, chainmail glinting dully in the sunlight. Compared to your itchy wool tunic, their gear looks like high fashion. You're ushered into a hall where the Lord himself sits on a wooden chair, not exactly a throne, but raised high enough to make you feel small. He's dressed in a finely dyed surcoat, a gold clasp glinting at his shoulder, and his boots are so polished you can see your reflection. The message is clear. He's the boss, and you'd better bow low enough to test your spine. And bow you do, partly from respect, partly because you don't want to be accused of insolence. After all, the feudal system works on a simple pyramid. Peasants farm the land, lords collect the surplus, and everyone promises loyalty to someone higher up. In return, the lord is supposed to protect you from raiders, bandits, and general chaos. It's not exactly a balanced contract, but it's the one you're stuck with. One historical fact for you. In many parts of medieval Europe, Peasants were bound to the land as serfs. That meant you couldn't just pack up and leave if you didn't like your boss. Your obligations included giving part of your harvest to the Lord, working his fields a certain number of days a week, and paying various fees. That seemed suspiciously like the medieval version of hidden charges on a phone bill. The Lord's steward approaches you now, holding a wax tablet. He rattles off what you owe: grain, labor, maybe even a chicken or two for good measure. You nod, though inside you're wondering if you should have hidden that loaf of bread from the market. But you hand over what you can, and the steward scribbles something down. Debt settled at least for today. As you leave the hall, you catch sight of the manor kitchen, where servants prepare a meal fit for a noble. Platters of meat roast over the fire, the aroma making your stomach growl despite your earlier bread. Unlike peasants, nobles enjoy far more meat, beef, pork. Venison and their tables are spiced with luxuries from abroad. You think of your breakfast beer-soaked crust and sigh. Nobles don't just eat better. They eat like a whole different species. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some lords actually collected taxes in odd forms, like honey, eggs, or even beeswax. In one region, peasants were required to give their lord a certain number of eels every year. Yes, eels. Imagine standing in front of your boss, holding a wriggling sack and saying, "Here's this month's payment." It sounds absurd, but to the medieval mind, it was just another Tuesday. Stepping back outside, you wander the manor grounds. Chickens cluck, pigs snuffle, and a couple of geese hiss at you with surprising menace. Beyond the yard, you see the Lord's private fields, larger and more carefully tended than the narrow strips you worked earlier. These lands are the true backbone of his wealth, worked by peasants like you, filling his granaries, while you hope for enough leftovers to get through the winter. Historians still argue whether feudal obligations were crushingly unfair, or simply the glue that held society together. Some say peasants lived under constant exploitation. Others suggest the system offered stability in a chaotic age. Standing here, watching the steward tallying debts and the lord feasting on roasted venison, you suspect the peasants didn't need a historian to tell them which side of the pyramid was heavier. As you prepare to leave the manor, the guards eye you again. You bow politely, then shuffle back toward the village. The manor looms behind you, a reminder that your life isn't entirely your own. Every loaf you bake, every furrow you plow, every sheep you shear, it all circles back here. To the man in the polished boots, still as you step onto the dirt road, you hear laughter from the village below, the hum of market chatter still drifting faintly in the air. Life may be hard under the manor's shadow, but it's also stubborn, resilient, and filled with small joys that no amount of taxes can stamp out. And as you glance down at your itchy tunic again, you think at least he didn't ask for eels. The Lord's manor fades behind you as you make your way down a rutted dirt road. The chatter of the market and the clucking of chickens give way to a different sound, the clang of metal on metal, rhythmic and sharp. You follow it, curiosity pulling you along, until you emerge into a clearing where a group of men are suiting up in armor. At first, it's underwhelming. You expected gleaming silver knights straight out of storybooks, but the reality is messier. The men are swearing under their breath, struggling to strap on pieces of chainmail that look heavy enough to sink a ship. One knight in training attempts to fasten his greaves, but nearly tips over. Another, already red in the face, complains about the heat inside his helmet. You realize quickly wearing armor is less. Glorious battlefield and more. Sauna in a tin can. A young squire notices you watching and flashes a grin. First time seeing armor? He asks, hauling a breastplate over his shoulder. You nod, unable to look away. He lifts the plate high, then sets it onto his knight's chest with a loud clang. It takes several straps and buckles to hold it in place. And by the time they're done, the knight looks less like a sleek warrior and more like a walking wardrobe. Here's a straightforward historical fact. A full suit of plate armor in the late middle. Ages could weigh up to 60 pounds. That's like carrying a small child everywhere you go. Yet, contrary to the myth, knights could still move fairly well, though running. A marathon in it was definitely off the table. One of the men mounts a horse, the animal snorting nervously under the added weight. The knight lowers his visor with a dramatic clank, and suddenly he looks intimidating, even majestic. You can see why legends romanticize these figures up on horseback, with sunlight bouncing off polished steel. A knight really does resemble a hero. But then the horse sneezes, the knight jerks awkwardly, and you stifle a laugh. So much for the flawless image. Nearby, wooden stands have been set up for a tournament practice. Two long lances lean against a rack, polished and deadly looking. Two knights line up at opposite ends of the tilt, gripping their lances tightly. The crowd, mostly peasants like you, gathers to watch. There's no Netflix here. Jousting is the medieval equivalent of binge-worthy drama. The horn sounds, and the horses thunder forward, hooves pounding the earth like war drums. Dust rises in clouds as the knights lower their lances. The crowd gasps as the lances shatter against shields with a deafening crack. One knight wobbles dangerously, but manages to stay in the saddle. To everyone's relief and disappointment, children squeal with delight, and you catch yourself grinning too. For all its danger, there's an undeniable thrill to watching two armored giants collide. Historians still argue whether tournaments were mainly for military training or just overblown entertainment. Standing here, with the crowd cheering and coins changing hands in bets, it's clear they were a bit of both. Here's your quirky tidbit. Knights sometimes fought in tournaments, not just for glory, but for ransom. If you unhorsed your opponent, you could demand payment before giving back their horse or armor. It was less winner takes all, and more winner shakes you down politely. Imagine going home from a joust richer than you arrived. That's one way to pay your blacksmith bills. You edge closer to the sidelines, where squires scramble to fetch broken lances and lead nervous horses away. A boy no older than 12 drags a shield twice his size, his arms straining. Squires like him train for years, serving knights, polishing armor, and learning swordplay until, if they survive the bruises and boredom, they're knighted themselves. The training field echoes with grunts and clashes as knights practice sword fighting next. Steel meets steel in quick, brutal strikes. Sparks fly, shields dent, and you can almost feel the vibration of each blow in your own arms. It's impressive, yes, but it's also terrifying. One wrong move, one missed parry, and a life could end in a heartbeat. You glance down at your own soft hands, calloused only from a hoe, and silently thank the stars you weren't born into knighthood. Off to the side, a group of peasants whisper excitedly. They exchange exaggerated tales about knights slaying dragons or rescuing maidens. The legends grow taller with each telling, but you can't help smiling. Stories are as much a part of knighthood as the armor itself. Reality may be sweat and sore muscles, but myth wraps it all in a golden glow. As the training winds down, knights lift their visors, red-faced and drenched in sweat. Servants rush to unbuckle armor, peeling it off piece by piece. The men sigh with relief, stretching their stiff limbs like office workers after a long shift. The glamour fades once again, leaving behind tired, ordinary men who just happen to have bruises under their chainmail. You wander away from the field, the sound of clashing swords fading behind you. Knights, tournaments, and the shimmer of armor, it's thrilling to watch, but exhausting to imagine living. You scratch at your wool tunic and grin. Heavy armor may look impressive, but you'd take scratchy wool and sore feet over 60 pounds of steel any day. Well, most days, you leave the tournament grounds behind, following a winding path that climbs a hill. At the top, looming against the sky, stands the castle. You've seen it from afar, a jagged silhouette of stone and towers, but up close, it's even more imposing. The outer walls rise high, thick enough to make you wonder how anyone could ever break through. A deep ditch, not quite a moat, but close enough, circles the base, filled with muddy water that smells faintly of moss and horse droppings. Crossing the wooden drawbridge, you step under the heavy portcullis and into the courtyard. It's less romantic than you imagined. Chickens peck in the dust, pigs snuffle in corners, and servants scurry past with baskets and buckets. The air carries the mingled scents of smoke, sweat, and something boiling in the kitchens that you're not sure you want to identify. You glance up at the towering keep, the castle's heart. Its stone walls are pitted and dark. Windows' narrow slits meant more for archers than for sunlight. The place feels less like a palace and more like a fortified rock, designed for survival, not comfort. Inside the great hall, though, there's a shift. The ceiling soars above you, beams blackened with smoke. A long wooden table stretches down the center, flanked by benches where the Lord's household eats together. Tapestries hang on the walls, their colors faded but still vibrant enough to break the monotony of gray stone. They tell stories, hunts, battles, saints performing miracles each, thread woven to impress visitors and remind everyone of the family's prestige. At the high table sits the Lord again, this time joined by his family and a few knights. Their meal is laid out before them, roasted meats glistening with fat, trenchers of bread piled high, and goblets of wine gleaming in the candlelight. You can almost taste the feast from here, though you know you're not invited. Down at the far end of the hall, servants and lower-ranking folk eat their share. Their plates hold less meat, more pottage, and bread that looks suspiciously like what you had for breakfast. Still, everyone eats together under the same roof. A reflection of how the castle operates. One big household, layered with status, but bound by duty. Here's a straightforward historical fact. Castles weren't built for comfort. Drafts whistled through gaps in the stone. Smoke from the central fire filled the hall, and privacy was nearly non-existent. Nobles may have had feather beds and tapestries, but compared to your modern bedroom with heating and Wi-Fi, even they lived more like campers than royalty. As you move deeper into the castle, you find the kitchens. It's chaos in here, cooks shouting, pots clanging, fires roaring. A spit turns slowly, roasting a whole boar while kitchen boys scurry to baste it. The smell is overwhelming. Meat, onions, herbs, all blending into something that makes your mouth water. A woman stirs a massive cauldron of stew, while another kneads dough with strong, flour-dusted arms. In the corner, someone grinds spices with a mortar and pestle, releasing sharp, exotic scents that seem almost out of place in this rough, smoky chamber. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval diners didn't use forks, not widely. At least, they ate with knives, spoons, and their fingers. Bread often doubled as a plate, called a trencher. After the meal, the greasy bread might be eaten, given to the poor, or tossed to the dogs. So yes, the castle feast came with built-in edible dishware. You slip out of the kitchens and wander up a narrow spiral staircase. The steps are steep, uneven, and clearly designed to trip up attackers rather than make life easier for residents. At the top, you reach the battlements. The view is breathtaking. Rolling fields stretch out in every direction, dotted with villages like the one you woke up in this morning. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, and you can just make out the ribbon of the river glinting in the sun, but the battlements aren't just for the view, they're for defense. Arrow slits line the walls, and murder holes above the gate remind you just how serious castles were about survival. Historians still argue whether castles were primarily military strongholds or status symbols. Standing here, you sense they were both, practical defenses wrapped in stone and ceremony. You duck back inside and follow another corridor. The chambers here feel more private, still cold. Still drafty, but at least smaller than the cavernous hall. A bed covered with furs sits against one wall. A chest at its foot holding clothes and perhaps a few valuables. The air smells faintly of beeswax candles and dried lavender. A rare attempt at comfort. Servants pass by constantly, carrying linens, buckets of water, trays of food. Their lives are bound to this place as tightly as peasants are bound to the fields. And unlike the bustling village, the castle's rhythm feels formal, hierarchical, carefully ordered. Everyone has a role, and every role feeds into the Lord's authority. As you descend the stairs, you hear music from the hall below, someone plucking a lute, a voice rising in a soft ballad. The song drifts upward, weaving through the stone corridors like smoke. For a moment, the cold gray walls seem warmer, alive with the sound of laughter and melody. Stepping back into the courtyard, you feel the castle's weight pressing down not just its stone walls, but its presence in every life around it. It's both fortress and prison, center of power and keeper of order. And though you'll return to your simple hut tonight, you know the castle's shadow stretches all the way there. At least the pigs in the courtyard make it feel a little less intimidating. Some churches claimed to hold entire skulls of apostles, while others showed off less glamorous objects, like a saint's fingernail. Pilgrims would travel miles to see them, believing the relics held miraculous powers. Historians still argue whether these were genuine holy objects or clever fundraising tools for the church. Either way, you'd probably feel odd praying to a toenail. As the afternoon wears on, you witness a small bell ringing ritual. Children take turns tugging the ropes, their thin arms straining as the heavy bells groan overhead. The sound echoes for miles, announcing to every field and cottage that the hour has struck. It's a sound that marks life's rhythm more faithfully than any wristwatch ever could. Later, you sit with a group of villagers listening to the priest tell a story from the Bible. His voice is calm, almost hypnotic, and though you catch only fragments, the message is clear. Good behavior leads to salvation. Wickedness leads to eternal consequences. The villagers nod solemnly, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers. Fear and hope mingle in the air, shaping the choices of everyday life. You glance up at the crucifix above the altar, its carved figure gazing down with solemn eyes. In this world, every action from planting crops to eating dinner is touched by faith. To question it openly would be dangerous. To follow it, though, gives structure and meaning to even the hardest days. As dusk approaches, candles flicker in iron holders, their light dancing against the stone walls. The choir begins a hymn, their voices weaving together in harmony that makes your chest tighten unexpectedly. For a moment, you forget the mud, the hunger, the itch of your tunic. For a moment, it's just you, the music, and the calm weight of something bigger than yourself. You step outside again, the cool air brushing your face. The bells toll once more, echoing across the fields, pulling day into evening. Behind you, the church door creaks shut, but its presence lingers. It will linger tomorrow and the day after, as it has for centuries, shaping every life in the village, including yours. You wake the next morning with a tickle in your throat. The smoky air from the hearth hasn't done your lungs any favors. And after yesterday's church bells and drafty castle corridors, you feel a bit medievally sick. Lucky you, it's time to experience medicine in the Middle Ages. A villager suggests you visit the local wise woman. She lives in a small cottage at the edge of the village, and the smell of dried herbs hits you before you even step inside. Bundles of plants hang from the rafters. Mint, yarrow, lavender. Things you half recognize. And others you definitely don't. She ushers you onto a rough wooden stool, studies your face with serious eyes, and begins to prepare a concoction. Into a clay cup, she drops chamomile, honey, and a little ground root that smells faintly like garlic. You sip it, and though it tastes earthy, it soothes your throat. That's medieval healthcare for you, equal parts useful herb, superstition, and a prayer whispered under the healer's breath. Here's a straightforward historical fact. Much of medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The idea was that health depended on keeping these fluids in balance. If you had a fever, for example, doctors might recommend bloodletting to drain the excess. You don't exactly volunteer for that option today. Instead, your host ties a small charm around your wrist to ward off ill spirits. You smile politely, deciding not to mention that what you probably need is an extra blanket, and maybe some cough syrup. Of course, the wealthy had access to more elaborate treatments. In monasteries and early hospitals, monks copied medical texts from the ancient Greeks and Romans. They brewed potions, applied poultices, and sometimes even attempted surgeries, though without anesthesia. The experience was more nightmare than cure. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some remedies sound more like pranks than medicine. One medieval cure for toothache involved placing a dead mouse against your gums. Another suggested wearing a necklace of wormwood and dried toads to prevent plague. Strangely enough, garlic, onions, and honey, common in many recipes, actually do have antibacterial properties. So occasionally, the bizarre mixtures hit on something useful. Accidentally, of course. You wander through the village and notice another healer at work, a barber surgeon. His shop is marked by a striped pole outside, the same red and white spiral you see today. Inside, he sharpens his blades and explains proudly that he can cut hair, pull teeth, set broken bones, and yes, bleed you with leeches if you're feeling too full of bad blood. You decide a haircut might be the only safe option. At the castle, nobles deal with illness differently. Their chambers hold silver goblets of spiced wine, medicinal syrups imported from far-off lands, and expensive remedies like powdered gems or ground pearls. Historians still argue whether these luxury treatments actually worked, or were simply flashy displays of wealth. Either way, you suspect drinking ground sapphire doesn't do much except lighten your purse. Still coughing lightly, you return to the church garden you saw yesterday. A monk carefully tends the plants, clipping leaves into a basket. He explains that each herb has a purpose: sage for digestion, fennel for coughs, rosemary for memory. He pauses and tells you proudly that rosemary sprigs were once tucked under pillows to ward off bad dreams. You wonder if that works for waking nightmares, like facing leeches. As you leave, You pass a group of villagers whispering anxiously. Someone's fallen ill with a fever. The healer prescribes rest and herbs, but another villager mutters about curses. The line between sickness and sin feels thin here, sometimes too thin. People believe illness can be punishment from God, or perhaps the work of witches. Superstition blends with science until it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. And then there's the plague, yes, that plague. You don't see it here today, but everyone whispers about it. The way people in your own time talk about disasters. Whole villages gone, people carrying posies of herbs to cleanse the air. Doctors wearing bird-like masks stuffed with fragrant spices. The thought makes you pull your cloak tighter, suddenly aware of every sneeze around you. By evening, your throat feels a little better, whether from the honey tea or sheer luck. As you settle down on your straw mattress, you realize that medicine here isn't about guarantees, it's about hope. Hope that the herbs will work. Hope that the priest's blessing will hold. Hope that your humors won't go completely out of balance. And sometimes just hope that tomorrow you'll wake up feeling fine. At least no one's strapped a dead mouse to your face, yet your cough fades after a few days. And with your strength returning, you decide to venture beyond the village. The road stretches out like a dusty ribbon, lined with hedgerows and dotted with the occasional cottage or inn. Stepping onto it feels both thrilling and risky, because in the Middle Ages, travel is no casual stroll. It's an adventure, a gamble, and sometimes a downright bad idea. The first thing you notice is how empty the road seems. Unlike modern highways buzzing with cars, these medieval paths are often quiet, broken only by the creak of a cartwheel or the distant bark of a dog. Yet the silence hums with possibility and danger. Here's a straightforward, historical fact. Medieval roads weren't built for comfort. Many were old Roman routes, patched together with stones, while others were just beaten tracks of dirt. Rain turned them into mud traps, and in winter, some were nearly impassable. You pick your way carefully, boots squelching in spots where the earth clings stubbornly. But travel, you must whether for trade, pilgrimage, or simply to find work. You pass a merchant leading a donkey loaded with sacks of wool, bound for a market town. He nods a weary greeting, but keeps a firm grip on his purse. After all, bandits are as common on these roads as potholes. To lighten the mood, here's your quirky tidbit. Some travelers carried safe conduct letters, basically medieval hall passes signed by lords or kings, promising protection along the way. Of course, whether a bandit cared about your paperwork was another matter entirely. Imagine flashing a parchment at a robber and saying, "Excuse me, sir, but the king says you can't mug me." Not exactly foolproof. You trudge on and soon spot a roadside inn. Smoke curls from the chimney, promising warmth and maybe food. Inside, the air is thick with stew, beer, and the unmistakable smell of unwashed travelers. The innkeeper offers you a bowl of pottage, a thick soup of beans, grains, and whatever vegetables survived the season. It's hearty, if not particularly glamorous. The benches creak under the weight of merchants, pilgrims, and a few suspicious types who might be keeping an eye on your coin pouch. You overhear stories of far-off towns, strange fares, and once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimages to Canterbury, Santiago, or even Rome. Travel is slow, but stories travel fast, embroidered with each retelling until the road itself feels alive with rumor. Back outside, you pass a toll gate. A stern-looking man demands a few coins before you can continue. These tolls dot major routes, claimed by local lords eager to squeeze revenue from travelers. You pay up, though part of you wants to ask for a receipt just to see the look on his face. As the day wears on, the scenery shifts. You pass fields of golden grain, herds of sheep grazing under watchful shepherds, and distant woodlands where shadows stretch long and deep. Forests in the Middle Ages carry both beauty and fear hunters. Outlaws and wolves lurk among the trees. Every crack of a twig makes you quicken your pace. Historians still argue whether ordinary peasants traveled much at all or mostly stayed rooted to their villages. Some claim most people never went more than a few miles from home, while others point to evidence of surprising mobility, pilgrims walking hundreds of miles, seasonal workers following harvests, and wandering minstrels spreading songs across regions. Either way, the road connects lives, weaving villages into a patchwork of stories. By evening, you catch sight of a walled town in the distance. Its towers rise against the setting sun, promising safety and commerce. The sight would have been both a relief and a marvel to weary travelers centuries ago. Approaching the gates, you join a line of merchants waiting for entry, guards checking goods and collecting yet another toll. Inside, the streets bustle with energy. Stalls overflow with spices, cloth, and trinkets from across Europe and beyond. The air smells of roasted meat and tanned leather, mingled with less pleasant odors best left unmentioned. Bells ring from a nearby church. Children dart through alleys, and a minstrel strums a lute, singing about knights and dragons to anyone who'll toss a coin. You realize that though the roads are rough, and the dangers many, the rewards of travel are immense. Markets thrive, ideas spread, and distant lands feel a little closer with every mile. For now, you find a quiet corner near the city walls. Lay your head on your rolled-up cloak, and let the muffled sounds of the bustling town lull you into sleep. At least you made it this far without running into wolves or worse. A barber surgeon with travel-sized leeches the next morning. You wake to the sound of bells and laughter echoing through the town. Something feels different in the air, lighter, brighter, buzzing with anticipation. Soon you realize why. Today is a festival day. In the Middle Ages, festivals are more than just parties. They're the glue that holds communities together. A chance to break from endless toil and celebrate the seasons. Saints or sheer survival. Villagers, merchants, and nobles all mingle in the streets, though not quite on equal footing. Ribbons flutter from wooden poles. Musicians set up along corners, and the smell of roasting meat drifts over the square. You follow the crowd toward the heart of the celebration. Excitement tugging at your feet, a maypole rises before you, tall and wrapped with colorful streamers. Children laugh as they circle it, weaving patterns with ribbons. A fiddler scrapes out a jaunty tune, joined by the thump of drums. You can't help tapping your foot, though keeping up with medieval. Dance steps is a workout in itself. Here's a straightforward historical fact. Festivals often followed the agricultural calendar. But tonight, you belong to the festival, wrapped in ribbons, songs, and the simple joy of being part of something larger than yourself. And hey, at least you didn't have to wrestle the greased pig. That's one contest you definitely lose. The festival fades into memory. And when morning arrives, you're back among the steady rhythm of work. Life in the Middle Ages is defined less by celebrations and more by endless tasks, fields to plow, wool to spin, iron to hammer. Every pair of hands, young or old, has its place. You wake early, the town stirring before sunrise. This time, instead of wandering markets or dancing by bonfires, you decide to learn a trade. Work is survival, but it's also craft, identity, and sometimes even pride. You begin in a small workshop tucked along a narrow street, where the rhythmic clang of metal draws you in. A blacksmith wipes sweat from his brow, sparks flying as he hammers red-hot iron into shape. You're handed a pair of heavy tongs, and instantly regret volunteering because holding molten metal feels like juggling lava. The blacksmith chuckles at your awkward grip. "Steady," he says, "or you'll lose your eyebrows." You try to mimic his swing, though your hammer blow lands with all the grace of a falling brick. Here's a straightforward historical fact. Blacksmiths were essential to medieval life. They forged nails, horseshoes, tools, weapons, and even delicate household items. Their skills placed them at the heart of villages and towns, respected and occasionally feared because working with fire and iron seemed almost magical. After blistering your palms and nearly setting your sleeve on fire, you decide maybe blacksmithing isn't your calling. Next, you slip into a weaver's workshop. Wooden looms dominate the space, threads stretched tight in a rainbow of wool. The weaver shows you how to shuttle yarn back and forth, slowly forming a patterned cloth. The rhythm is soothing, like the beating heart of the workshop itself. But here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval cloth wasn't just for clothing, it was currency. In some places, bolts of fine wool or linen could be traded like money. Guilds carefully controlled quality, making sure no one cut corners. You imagine paying your rent in fabric. "Sorry, landlord. Can I interest you in this stylish plaid instead of coins?" From weaving, you wander to the shoemaker's stall, where leather scraps litter the floor. He hands you an awl and needle, challenging you to stitch a sole onto a shoe. 10 minutes later, you've managed to stab your thumb twice and sew the leather inside out. The shoemaker shakes his head, muttering that not everyone's cut out for the craft. Fair enough. Historians still argue whether apprenticeships were golden opportunities or near indentured servitude. Some say they gave young people skills and steady futures. Others point out apprentices worked long hours for little pay, sometimes living in harsh conditions under strict masters. Either way, you realize training for a craft demanded patience, precision, and years of effort, qualities you may not quite have mastered. Back outside, the smell of wood smoke leads you to a carpenter's yard. Logs are split, saws sing, and shavings pile like snowdrifts on the ground. The carpenter shows off a half-finished chest, carved with vines and leaves that almost seem to move. Furniture isn't just practical here. It's art. You run your hand over the smooth surface and think, maybe this is closer to your speed. Still, you can't help noticing how interconnected all the trades are. The blacksmith makes tools for the carpenter. The weaver provides cloth for the shoemaker. The carpenter builds looms and benches. Work in the Middle Ages is a web, each thread pulling tight to hold the community together. As evening falls, guild members gather in a nearby hall. Candles flicker, casting long shadows over painted shields and wooden beams. The guildmaster speaks, reminding everyone that rules keep standards high and protect livelihoods. Apprentices sit quietly, journeymen whisper, and masters nod with pride. For a moment, you feel part of something greater, a tradition stretching back centuries, binding work with honor. But then someone offers you another chance with the shoemaker's awl. And you quickly remember, maybe your place isn't as a medieval craftsman. Still watching the pride in their eyes, you understand why these trades mattered so deeply. Work wasn't just labor. It was legacy. By the time you crawl into bed, hands sore, ears ringing with hammer blows and loom beats, you're certain of one thing. You might not be cut out for shoemaking, but you'll never again take modern Sneakers for granted, the next day begins not with the clang of hammers or the chatter of the market, but with something quieter, almost reverent. A monk passes by in his brown robe, arms full of rolled parchment. Curious, you follow him through winding lanes until you reach a monastery perched on a hill, its stone walls heavy with silence. Inside, the air smells of beeswax, ink, and centuries of whispered prayers. You're led into the scriptorium, a long room lined with desks and tall windows that spill pale light over worn wooden benches. Here, monks bend over manuscripts, quills scratching steadily, as though time itself slows down to match their strokes. You take a seat, handed a feather pen and a pot of ink, and the real challenge begins. Writing in the Middle Ages is an art form delicate, precise, painfully slow. Each letter curls elegantly. Each word spreads like a painting across the page. You try your hand at copying a line of Latin, though your letters wobble like a child's drawing. By the time you finish, your sleeve is smudged with black ink, and the monk beside you is politely suppressing laughter. Here's a straightforward historical fact. Literacy in the Middle Ages was rare, especially among peasants. Reading and writing were skills largely reserved for clergy, nobles, and a handful of merchants. For most people, knowledge passed orally through songs, sermons, and storytelling. Books painstakingly copied by hand were treasures more valuable than gold. You look around, marveling at illuminated manuscripts glittering with gold leaf, margins burst with strange doodles, dragons, rabbits jousting on snails, even monks making faces. And here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval scribes sometimes slipped jokes into their manuscripts. A bored monk might sketch a silly creature in the corner or pen a sarcastic note complaining about cold fingers and dull quills. It seems even the most sacred work left room for mischief. The abbot invites you deeper into the library, where rows of chained books line the shelves. Heavy iron links keep them tethered, a reminder that these volumes are irreplaceable. You run your fingers over the spines, wishing you could open every one, though the Latin text inside might as well be Martian. Historians still argue whether education in the Middle Ages was stifled by the church or sustained by it. Some claim the church restricted knowledge, keeping it within cloistered walls. Others argue that without monks laboring to preserve texts, much of ancient wisdom would have vanished. Either way, sitting among these silent guardians of knowledge, you sense both restriction and preservation at play. Outside the monastery, you encounter a rare school attached to the church. Children huddle on benches, reciting their lessons aloud. The schoolmaster whacks a stick against the table when attention drifts, which, judging by the glazed eyes around you, happens often. Lessons focus on Latin prayers, basic arithmetic, and the moral order of society. Forget multiplication tables, memorizing psalms is the priority here. You try to join in, mumbling along with the chants, though your tongue trips over unfamiliar syllables. A boy next to you giggles, whispering that you sound like a drunken goose. Fair point. By late afternoon, you step into the cloister garden, where monks tend herbs used for both medicine and ink dyes. Bees hum lazily among lavender. Birds circle the stone arches overhead. There's a peace here that feels timeless, as though the noise of markets, lords, and battles can't quite reach. As the bells toll, signaling evening prayer, you reflect on the strange power of words. In your own time, you scroll endlessly through glowing screens. Information at your fingertips. But here, a single book is a lifetime's work, a jewel of thought and ink. You wonder how many ideas, stories, and discoveries were lost because they never found their way onto parchment or were locked away, unread. The monks file into the chapel, voices rising in plainchant, slow and resonant, like the heartbeat of the Middle Ages itself. You sit quietly, letting the sound wash over you, the Latin words drifting like waves, and as your eyelids grow heavy, you think, maybe you'd never survive as a scribe, your handwriting's bad. Enough in the modern world, but you can't help admiring the patience, devotion, and humor of those who did. After all, anyone who can write scripture and still doodle a rabbit, jousting on a snail has earned your respect. The days roll on, and soon you find yourself swept into one of the most dramatic currents of medieval life, war. Not every peasant or craftsman marches off to battle, but the presence of war hangs over everyone lord's plotting campaigns. Taxes rising to pay for armor, rumors of distant crusades drifting through taverns. And tonight, as you drift into this chapter of your journey, you wake to the clatter of hooves, the scent of oiled leather, and the unmistakable clang of swords. A knight stands before you, clad in chainmail, his surcoat emblazoned with a bright heraldic symbol. He's not heading to a jousting game this time. He's preparing for the real thing, a call to arms. With little ceremony, he tosses you a padded gambeson, and you realize you're about to join a medieval campaign. Slipping into armor is less glamorous than movies suggest. It's heavy, awkward, and smells faintly of sweat and rust. By the time the squire buckles the last strap, you feel like a metal-clad turtle. You stumble toward your horse, only to discover the cruel truth. Medieval saddles are not built for beginners. You cling on, wobbling as the troop rides out, praying you don't fall before reaching the battlefield. Here's a straightforward historical fact. Medieval armies were rarely massive, Hollywood-style hordes. Most consisted of a lord's knights, his retainers, and peasant levies called up in times of need. Battles were often short and brutal, with more men dying from disease and poor conditions than from swords. The march stretches on, dust rising from dozens of boots and hooves. You hear men grumble about rations, hard bread, dried meat, and if you're lucky, watered wine. One soldier tells you he once boiled his shoes for soup during a long campaign. You laugh nervously, hoping it's a joke. Judging by his face, it's not. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some knights carried lucky charms into battle. Locks of hair, bones of saints, even bits of parchment inscribed with protective prayers. One man beside you proudly shows off a tiny frog skull tied to his belt, swearing it keeps arrows from striking. You decide not to question the science. When the army halts, tents rise like a forest of canvas. You try to sleep, but the air is thick with tension. Soldiers whisper about tomorrow's clash, some praying, others boasting loudly about how many FOs they'll strike down. One fellow next to you snores like a war drum, keeping everyone awake. You almost wish you had that frog skull charm. At dawn, the horns sound. The field stretches before you, mist curling low over grass. Opposite, the enemy banners snap in the wind, bright colors. Strange crests. The same mixture of fear and determination mirrored in your own line. Knights lower their lances. Infantry tighten their ranks, and suddenly, the ground trembles as horses surge forward. The noise is overwhelming, steel on steel. Arrows whistling overhead, shouts mixing with the crash of shields. You raise your borrowed spear, aiming it clumsily, while praying no one notices how badly your hands are shaking. Somehow, you stumble through the chaos, managing not to fall underfoot. Truth be told, you spend more time ducking than striking. Historians still argue whether Medieval battles were as frequent and decisive as stories suggest. Some claim they were rare, with sieges and skirmishes far more common. Others argue battles shaped the entire political map of Europe. What's certain is that war defined the medieval mindset: glory for some, terror for most, and endless hardship for those left behind in villages. When the dust settles, the field is a mess of broken weapons, splintered shields, and exhausted men. You're still alive, though mostly because you stayed at the edge, pretending to be very busy holding the banner. Smart move. A grizzled knight claps your shoulder, laughing that you fought like a hero. You're not sure if he's being serious or sarcastic, but you'll take it. As night falls, campfires flicker, songs rise, and soldiers boast about victories. You sip weak ale, trying to steady your nerves. The knight who loaned you the frog's skull claims it saved you after all. No arrow touched you. Maybe he's right. Maybe luck matters as much as skill in a medieval war. By the time you curl up on your cloak, sore, filthy, and still trembling from the noise of battle, you realize something. Surviving medieval war isn't about bravery. It's about endurance, luck, and a very good excuse to hang back with the banner. The war drums fade into memory, and soon you find yourself back within the cold stone walls of a castle under siege. This time, you're not outside on the battlefield, but trapped inside, waiting. The air is thick with smoke from torches and the nervous whispers of townsfolk, crammed into the bailey. Supplies are stacked in corners: barrels of grain, salted meat, buckets of water, but everyone knows it won't last forever. Sieges were the most common form of medieval warfare. Instead of endless, glorious battles, most conflicts boiled down to waiting games. Attackers would surround a castle, cutting off supplies until hunger, disease, or sheer despair forced surrender. Some sieges lasted weeks. Others dragged on for months. The unlucky defenders inside often grew gaunt and weary, long before swords ever clashed. You stand atop the ramparts, peering out over the walls. Beyond lies a forest of enemy tents and war machines. Tall wooden towers inching closer, ladders stacked for scaling, and most fearsome of all, trebuchets. You watch as one creaks forward, slinging a massive stone that smashes against the wall with bone-rattling force. Dust rains down, and you duck instinctively. The knight beside you shrugs and mutters that it'll take 100 more to break through, comforting. Here's a quirky tidbit. Attackers sometimes hurled not just stones but also dead animals, rotting corpses, or even plague-infected bodies over the walls, hoping to spread disease and terror. As you imagine that, you clutch your cloak tighter, suddenly grateful for the faint smell of smoke covering worse odors. Days crawl by. You help ration bread so stale it could double as a weapon. Buckets of water grow murkier. People mutter about famine. Children cry at night. And you wonder how long you'd last before dreaming of shoe soup again. Yet, despite it all, there's resilience. People sing softly around fires, patch broken walls with whatever wood they can find, and cling to faith that the siege will break before they do. Historians still argue whether castles were true fortresses or symbols, more than practical defenses. Some believe they were nearly impregnable, dominating landscapes with raw power. Others point to records of castles falling shockingly fast when supplies ran out. You lean against the cold stone and wonder which side of the argument your current predicament supports. Then one night, a horn blares from outside the walls. Shouts echo, fires blaze, and through the smoke, you glimpse banners fluttering, not enemies this time, but allies. A relief force charges in, scattering the besiegers. Cheers erupt from within the castle, and for the first time in weeks, hope surges through the weary crowd. When the gates swing open the next morning, sunlight pours in, and fresh food arrives with the victors. You bite into bread that's soft for the first time in forever, savoring it like a feast. War still rages across kingdoms, but for now, you've survived. And as you step beyond the walls, you notice something else. The world is changing. Traders bring news of strange new inventions, mechanical clocks ticking in distant cities, paper from the east making books cheaper, whispers of a new age stirring beyond the medieval horizon. The Middle Ages, with all its hardship and wonder, is slowly giving way to something brighter. The Renaissance waits just over the hill. You walk down the dusty road, castle fading behind you, carrying the sounds, smells, and strange lessons of medieval life. And maybe, just maybe, you feel grateful for your own century's comforts, clean water, soft beds, and a world where bread doesn't double as a doorstop. Now the noise of war fades, the torches dim, and the walls of the castle drift away like mist in morning light. You're left standing in a meadow, soft grass underfoot, fireflies blinking gently as if the stars have descended to earth. The air is calm, cool, and sweet with the scent of wildflowers. Take a slow breath. Imagine the heaviness of armor lifting off your shoulders, the dust of the battlefield brushing away, the worries of survival melting into quiet. The long road through medieval times has carried you through villages and markets, castles and churches, feasts and famines, but now, at last, it brings you here, into rest. The bells of a distant church toll faintly, not as a summons, but as a lullaby. Their echoes rise and fade into the night, softer and softer, until only the rhythm of your own breathing remains. You feel safe, wrapped in stillness, as if the centuries themselves are tucking you in. Let your mind wander gently across the memories of your journey. Scribes with inky fingers, markets full of chatter, feasts of mead and laughter, and even nights with their odd lucky charms. Let them blur and soften like candle flames flickering low. There's no need to hold onto the noise of history now. You can let it go, knowing it will still be there when you wake. For tonight, all that matters is this meadow, this peace, this moment. Close your eyes. Let the hum of the fan, the quiet of your room, carry you deeper into sleep. The medieval world drifts away, leaving you weightless, calm, and ready to dream. Sweet dreams, traveler. End of script. Sweet dreams.